Old War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires Nurgle, a great race in many respects after their rework with Thrones of Decay, with a really good selection of units, heroes, and lords. Not necessarily so much legendary lords, at least with Epidemius, but when you look at the Nurgle roster, you have some of the best infantry in the game, a really solid selection of monster units, even flying units over here that are actually quite solid, good selection of magic, you name it. Nurgle does have the unit roster for it. It is certainly melee focused, and there are going to be issues with regards to that, but that isn't the problem. Especially if you're playing as Tamarkan, who not only has access to the regular Nurgle roster, but has access to his chieftains. And of course, you can always spice up that kind of unit roster with allied recruitment. This helps you out in terms of filling the gaps that you might have in a unit roster, especially with regards to artillery, because that is actually one of the problems the Nurgle does have with regards to their unit roster, especially given the sieges that you may have to deal with in the course of a campaign. Assuming you even have to fight those sieges, because Nurgle has such heavily armored units available in his campaign that you could genuinely auto-resolve the vast majority of battles after a certain point in a campaign. But there are absolutely problems that Nurgle does have to deal with as well. Issues that I would say diminish the Nurgle experience in every single Legendary Lord campaign, regardless of who you're playing, Tamarkan, Kugath, or Epidemius. And for the record, I don't think Epidemius is a campaign worth playing. So the first issue is time, construction time. Every single Nurgle military structure, so basic military structure, advanced military structure, does take a good amount of time to construct. Yes, once you build it, it will just cycle through the various tiers, and you can speed up the cycle by spending infections, but the fact that it does take a good amount of time to actually construct it is a pretty annoying factor. Especially if you're trying to take advantage of one of the more powerful things that Nurgle has, which is vassalization through diplomacy. Diplomatic vassalization is a really powerful tool. Now granted, I did piss off Astrogoth over here by fighting a war with him, but one of the ways you make diplomatic vassalization work is by selling territory that has military structures in them. So for instance, the Great Skull Legs had basic barracks over there. But when it takes multiple turns to just construct a basic barracks, that kind of diminishes the potential of a Nurgle campaign from a diplomatic standpoint. And that is something of an annoyance to deal with when you're playing any of the Nurgle campaigns, because it does limit your recruitment options. It's not necessarily so much that you're going to need these units, and eventually at one point in your campaign you'll just be literally spamming units, like very cheap units. I'm not quite sure why they're free to recruit over here. I mean, I know that high Nurgle corruption reduces Nurgle recruitment costs, but it shouldn't be quite free. I'm not exactly sure what's happened over there. Maybe some mod is coming up with that, but I don't think so. I'm certainly not using any mod that should interfere with that. I'm literally just using very basic mods like, Toggle Fog of War, all that kind of stuff. Might be some interference, might be a bug, I don't know. But regardless, it is absolutely a problem with regards to Nurgle campaigns, because this time that it takes to just construct barracks and the cycle time does limit your early game unit variety. And it also means that in a Nurgle campaign, you're not really going to use as much of the unit roster as you really could to actually have a good campaign experience. The reason is that the Rancid Aloe and the Living Tree of Decay blow the other structures completely out of the water. If you can get one of these, it's worth it far more than getting the others. And even when you have one of these, it's just better to get another one than bothering with, say, the demonic buildings in particular, like the Lesser Garden of Blight, the Lesser Garden of Blight versus the Living Tree of Decay. It's just not really worth it. So that is absolutely an issue. And by the time you do get these buildings, your campaign, given the campaign pacing, given the statistics we have from Creative Assembly themselves, it isn't really a great situation to be dealing with. Now, another issue tied together with the previous one is the infections resource. So infections are used for 3 things. 1, you use it to construct these buildings and to rush the cycle of these buildings. 2, you use it to unlock certain technologies that are very useful, but more importantly, they also unlock further, they unlock more of the research tree of Nurgle. So for instance, Contagious Horde costs 200, Fattening Seeds costs 200, Fattening Seeds 400, other technologies. But third, you use it to create plagues. But when you're using a resource for 3 things, really 4 things, because you could consider cycled buildings as opposed to just constructing them. When you're using a resource for 4 things, a limited resource at that, it does diminish a Nurgle campaign even further. Because Nurgle is supposed to be all about the plagues, but if you want to actually recruit units, you're going to need to spend your infections on that. And even when you have a good amount of infections, you're better off just getting more military buildings or research than you are spending on plagues. Like, I did get a plague over here, to be sure. Or I've gotten certain plagues, but let me just tell you, it's not really great to be forced to make that choice. It's the primary reason why the best Nurgle campaign, from the perspective of plagues at the very least, if not more perspectives, is actually Festus. Because he still gets infections, not as many as demonic Nurgle campaigns, but Festus doesn't have to spend them on unit recruitment. He doesn't have to spend them on research. He just spends them on plagues, and that creates a much better campaign dynamic for him to actually use those plagues, beyond the fact that Festus also has a bunch of benefits with plagues that, while not necessarily better than what Kugath or even Epidemius have in terms of plagues, does make him very, very competitive. And it is quite a shame, because Nurgle should be about the plagues, but the plague mechanic has always felt very underwhelming in a Nurgle campaign. And by the time it actually is powerful, again, the campaign is pretty much over. There's some really awesome effects, like, oh, I can get 30 armor on my units. I can reduce upkeep. I can I can reduce construction cost in a Nurgle campaign. All of these things are very substantial benefits, to be sure, but they're not as substantial as getting another army. Let's put it like that. Like, another army allows you to conquer more territory, gain more money. And money is not really as much of a factor in a Nurgle campaign, especially if you vassalize certain other factions by selling them territory. So it is a pretty substantial issue as far as I see it, that you're spending these infections on everything. And here's the issue I also have with it. When you're playing a Nurgle campaign, the ways you gain infections are also very limited themselves. The principal way to gain infections, or the principal ways of gaining infections, are either through battles, but they have to be field battles. It doesn't work with settlements. So you can either get them for battles, but it's not inherent in battles. Unlike, say, Chaos Dwarf Laborers or Dark Elves with Slaves, you don't gain infections naturally or inherently through winning a battle. You gain them as a specific post-battle option, which is not great because it limits how many infections you can get in a campaign, and you're also missing out on either cash or casualty replenishment. Neither cash or casualty replenishment are an issue, but the fact that you have to choose it and you don't get them inherently is a problem. Consider Dark Elves. Their post-battle option, they gain slaves, a certain amount of slaves inherently in a battle, after a battle, depending on what you're dealing with. And then they have a post-battle option that also gives them slaves, but also casualty replenishment. That is a substantially better system than one Nurgle has to deal with. So that is very, very much a problem. The other way you can gain infections is these structures, but this again creates this kind of dynamic in a Nurgle campaign where by the time you get a lot of these structures to have unlimited infections and, yes, spam plagues, units, etc., your campaign is over. It is certainly a campaign pacing issue. In general, the Immortal Empires is filled with races that have these kind of problems, right? Systems that are designed that are far slower than the actual campaign pacing is. As per Creative Assembly themselves, I think the statistics are something like most people finish campaigns by like turn 80 or so, and that should give you an idea. like, to be certain, this is a, turn 27, things are going to look very different for me in 53 more turns or so. But it's kind of also worth pointing out that even judging it based on that is not necessarily accurate. Because you got to also understand that the consequential portion of the campaign, the part where it's actually relevant, where it matters, where it has the most amount of impact, is not like turn 40, 50, or anything like that. The kind of campaigns slow down significantly or become a real grind after like turn 30 or 40, if not faster. It depends on what you're dealing with, but like consider Tamarkan's campaign. Let me put it like this. Consider Tamarkan's campaign. Your entire campaign dynamic is basically going to be decided by defeating Kolek, which can be tricky, potentially defeating Gremgor, which is, by the way, part of your victory conditions, and it's annoying that you can vassalize Gremgor for diplomacy, but you can't achieve your campaign victory through vassalization. Very, very frustrating when it is very much available, and why the heck wouldn't you do it? Gremgor is an amazing vassal. Why wouldn't you vassalize him? It is just an absurd situation. But beyond that aspect, though, my point is, by the time you get things going, like by the time these systems really come into play, or by the time you can get a lot of infections, you would have been forced to deal with Gremgor one way or another, either because he declared war on you, or because you vassalized him, or you declared war on him and destroyed him. Like, effectively, Tamarkan's campaign is over at the moment Kolek and Gremgor are dealt with one way or another. I'm not even considering Zarnagrund. Zarnagrund is guaranteed for you to take it. Regardless. Like, if you defeat Gremgor, you're going to have such a high level of power that waltzing in and taking Zarnagrund is a given in a campaign. Like, especially once you start having armies like this. Or like, these two armies took Zarnagrund, for instance. And even with actually fewer units, because I didn't necessarily have as many higher quality units as I did when my armies did march on Zarnagrund. I did have to use ambush tactics, to be short, and there are some vulnerabilities with that, but that's the point. Like, once you've dealt with this, GG, well played. Same with Kugaf. Like, once you've dealt with Greasus, Gorst, and Zarnagrund, GG, well played, campaign is over. Epidemius, Malachi, Malus Darkblade. That's kind of the problem, isn't it? Like, you have these slower pace systems, but the way the campaigns are designed, you're not in a position where you can sit on your ass and wait. Because if you give Gremgor the time, he will swarm you with 7, 6, 7, 8 plus stacks. And if you give Greasus time, right, and even if you survive that, you might just be giving Greasus time to take over the entire Mountains of Morn, and then you have to deal with that as well. So you're not really in a position where waiting is a really viable option. So that is a problem. But the biggest issue, I would say, that exists in a Nurgle campaign is with regards to climate. See, Nurgle, in theory, has a great deal of climate viability. This is great because Nurgle does get affected by climate far more than other races because, all those infection costs. You can solve any climate issues, by the way, with the climate penalty removal mod, to be sure. But I don't really think I should judge a race based on what a mod, even if it's a very simple, easy-to-use mod, does. It does say a lot that a Band-Aid solution like that does help fix a lot of problems with Nurgle, or improves the situation. I wouldn't say it fixes things necessarily. You can certainly get mods that give you faster build times, etc. But it is just the issue that Mountain is unpleasant. And again, Nurgle is affected by climate more than other races because of the infection situation, the cycle situation, the time it takes to build your basic military buildings, right? You could probably just ignore building them in mountain climate, but every Nurgle campaign, be it Epidemius, Kugaf, or Tamarkan, have their campaign objectives. Not just even the fact that they start next to mountains. No, their campaign objectives are to deal with mountains, one way or another, in a campaign. I've also got to say, Tamarkan's short campaign victory condition is absurdly stupid. Like, fight free chieftain battle, devoted for chieftain battles. That is such a freaking grind, man. Like, it's not horrible to have to get these chieftains to a high level, but it is just, a meaningless grind. Like, I'll get it done, but it just takes takes a while to get there, and it's just kind of annoying. I mean, I guess it's better than having to take 30 different settlements, but then it gets ruined by like having to kill Grimgor and Greases. That's great, not quite, in a lot of ways. But yeah, the climate dynamic is a significant problem. I find it absurd that Nurgle struggles with mountains. Like, if it's a question of the cold, you got frozen viable, so it's like, that's ridiculous. I actually find it ridiculous that Temperate Island, you know, Ulf 1, which is supposed to be not a pleasant location for demons, for very clear and obvious reasons in Warhammer lore, but Ulf 1 is viable, whereas mountains are not. Like, what kind of mountains are these? Like, it's kind of nonsensical that magical forests are on the same tier as mountains. It has been an issue of mine ever since Nurgle was reworked. It is easily fixable with a mod, sure, but inherently this is one of the bigger problems in Nurgle campaign, combined with everything else. It's not just one issue, it's everything else. It leads to a diminished campaign experience in every single Nurgle campaign because of that. Like, Nurgle is fine. Like, in terms of unit roster, in terms of economy, like money, actual money, not infections, it's fine. It just annoying. Or I guess the term I would use is boring, really, to deal with. Because you end up with a campaign where a lot of the systems that give you a lot of power are only going to come into play by the time you actually finish your campaign. But even winning your campaign is not really that tricky, to be sure. In any of the Nurgle campaigns, with the exception of Epidemius. And even with Epidemius, you don't have to find Malice Darkblade instantly, just worth pointing out. There's a lot of things you can do in an Epidemius campaign to avoid that particular fight for quite a decent amount of time. So that by the time you actually do fight him, you're significantly more powerful than him, and he's not the nightmare that he could be. Regardless, that's all I had to say. Questine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.